Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was voted this month was unique Magic cards. I was really excited to see this one win the voting this month because this has been a subject that held my fascination ever since my earliest days as a Magic player. You know, there have been tens of thousands of unique Magic cards over the years, and some grammarians might say it's improper to say something is more or less unique, but I beg to differ. There certainly are Magic cards for which the label is more or less applicable. Some nominally unique cards are vanilla creatures that differ only in name and possibly creature type. On the other end of the spectrum, the most unique cards have their own rules and sometimes even whole sections of the CR dedicated to explaining how they work. Such cards are the topic of today's video. I imagine that the first question on most people's minds is how many of these cards are there? And, well, that's a more difficult question than might appear at first glance. For example, Shahrazad is the only card that lets you play a subgame. In black-bordered Magic, that is. There are 3 other cards that use subgames, all of them from unsets. So does Shahrazad count? What about Steamflogger Boss, whose unique rule is just a note that assembling a contraption is only possible in unmagic? What about Power Play, appropriately the first card in the CR to be so singled out? In all, there are 20 rules in the comprehensive rules that outright state that they refer to a specific single card. Before we go through them, a moment of silence for their fallen brethren. From time to time, a card or mechanic will be so beloved that more similar cards will end up getting printed. Such was the case with our steam-flogging friend. Miro has publicly stated that its printing in Future Sight was originally intended more or less as a joke. There were no plans to ever introduce contraptions to the game at that time, but enough people kept on asking for them that Miro finally had to put them in Unstable a decade later. Back in my day, Mindslaver and Time Stop were the only cards that made use of their respective mechanics, but these two are no longer unique thanks to their enduring popularity. A list of all the rules that at one time were specific to specific cards would be extremely difficult to compile, but those two have a special place in my heart because they were from my earliest days of playing Magic. There are a few major categories of ways for a card to get its own unique rule. First, there are cards from ye olde days of Magic that predate the time when the game rules were expected to be comprehensive. When the rules were standardized, some card effects didn't translate over very well. Sometimes this was because they happened to be the only card that had that effect, and therefore an individual rule was needed to define how that effect worked. Such was the case with Drain Power and Shahrazad. Other times, there were other cards that had similar effects, but for technical reasons, the card couldn't be worded in the same way. For example, let's have a look at Circling Vultures. At first glance, you might think that, well, we could just update its wording to have a nice activated ability, something like this. But the problem is that this isn't exactly the same. For one, it would get stopped by a Pithing Needle, whereas the original wouldn't. Another issue is that the Circling Vultures doesn't end up in the graveyard until after the activated ability resolves. So in some corner case scenarios, such as if someone played an instant speed Transgress the Mind, you would have a different functionality. In general, Wizards took great pains to preserve the original functionality of cards wherever possible, even if that meant adding special rules specifically for them. Another great example is Volrath's Shapeshifter. This is the actual Oracle text of that card, and obviously we needed a special rule defining what having the full text of a card means. If you read carefully, you'll notice that it's pretty darn similar to becoming a copy of that card. In fact, if you look at the original version, that was clearly the intention. So why come up with a whole new mechanic to do pretty much the same thing? Go ahead and pause the video if you want to think about what the problem is. The answer should be pretty clear to those of you who have seen my presentation on continuous effects. The copying layer happens before the control changing layer. So if the Volrath's Shapeshifter was affected by a control changing effect and it was worded as a copy effect, it would still look at its original controller's graveyard. Text changing effects apply after that though. Making it a text changing effect guarantees that it will always look at its current controller's graveyard. And the last 3 old cards that are on the list I'll address together because even though they each have their own rule, they're all very similar. Go ahead and guess now if you're playing along at home. Ready? Okay, here you go. City in a Bottle, Golgoth and Silex, and Apocalypse Chime all deal with cards from a specific set. Originally, they started off by keying off the expansion symbol, but it gradually became more and more clear that this wasn't a good way to do it. Besides the fact that there are different printings of cards that could have the same expansion symbol, and the weirdness of making expansion symbol be a copyable characteristic, the final straw was that it really sucked having cards from different sets play differently. And so 3 new rules were formed that specifically spelled out which cards that these 3 would affect. All the remaining cards on the list are from what I'll call the modern era of Magic. There are no more cards that needed a weird rule to preserve their traditional functionality, but there certainly still were plenty of cards that have unique splashy effects that need a rule to explain how they work. To me, the poster child of this is Karn Liberated, who gets a whole section of the CR to describe what restarting the game means. In a similar vein, they might have done my boy Time Stop dirty, but Mandate of Peace still is the only card that has you end a phase. Stick Together is the only card that has you choose a party, Garth One-Eye is the only one that lets you copy an object that's not part of the game, and Spy Kid is the only way to have all the names of non-legendary creatures. I think Cryptic Spires deserves special mention here as the card that managed to bring unmet mechanics to real Magic, and oh yeah, there's that, because of all of this compares to the set that brought literal unmechanics to real Magic. Celebrate K was relatively tame, just a definition of what it means to roll doubles, but the other 4 cards from that set represent effects that are way too wacky to have ever been conceived of before Marrow decided his lifelong dream took precedence over nearly 3 decades of brand and rules managers saying no. Here's a fun challenge question. What set do you think has the most cards with their own specific rules in it? If you said Unfinity, you would be incorrect. But wait, how can that be? We've already talked about all of the cards with rules that specifically reference them, and no other set has had as many as 5. This is the other difficulty with the question of how many cards there are with their own specific rules. Not all of the specific rules advertise themselves. All the ones we've seen so far have specifically said that they apply to only one card right in the text of the rule itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the rules that apply to only one card will have the same property. For example, consider this rule here. Even though it doesn't specifically call it out, Serum Powder is the only card that uses the phrase anytime you could mulligan, so this rule is specific to that card. Now, it's easy enough to confirm that through an Oracle search for that phrase, but in other cases, this is not so easy to confirm. For instance, can you think of any other card that has a trigger condition of another ability triggering? I couldn't, but this isn't trivial to search for, so I don't have any evidence that it's the only one. I'll go over all the individual rules that I could think of, or find on a list that someone else had posted. Big props to whoever came up with the idea for the unique CR reference tag on Scryfall, by the way. But there's no guarantee that there isn't some oddball example or counterexample that I and the other good people of the internet have all missed. If you can think of anything along those lines, I'm sure I'm not the only person who would be interested in hearing about it in the comments. If I need to issue some errata to this video in a pinned comment after the fact, well, so be it. Alright, now getting back to the question of which set has had the most individual rules, would you believe Modern Horizons 2 has as many as Unfinity? I couldn't either, but unless someone else knows a card that can add a cost to activate a loyalty ability, or something that has an ability that doesn't function in a particular zone, or something that has Trample over Planeswalkers or Devour Artifact, adding in our one-eyed friend Garth here puts MH2 at 5 also. I'm leaving these last 2 on screen because they're a little bit of a hint as to the only set that has more than 5 cards. And like Modern Horizons 2, one of those cards has already appeared in this episode. Place your bets now. That's right, it is Future Sight. Being the only card with a keyword or a variant of a keyword is the most common way to end up on the list. And if you were playing in Future Sight, you might remember that that was a core part of that set's gimmick. By my count, 9 new keywords were introduced in this set, some hinting at potential new developments and some added strictly as red herrings, and all of them unique, or nearly so. Of these, Absorb, Aura Swap, Transfigure, and Frenzy, asterisk, remain unique. Pour one out for our most recent Fallen Comrade, Fortify. Combine these with Steamflogger Boss and the only card that lets you search part of a library for an impressive record total. There's a handful of other cards that have their own rules by virtue of being the only one with a keyword, which I'll briefly go through now. In addition, there are a bunch more that got their own rules because they interact with a keyword in a unique way. Alms Collector is the only card that cares about drawing 2 cards at once, something replacement effects originally didn't even allow for. Verna plays with Cascade, Benevolent Blessing gives a weird condition for protection, Bruvac doesn't play nice with cards that mill 1 card and check a characteristic of that card that was milled. Doubling Cube is the only way to double mana, Enhanced Surveillance lets you surveil like Google and the NSA had a baby. Manifesting 2 cards at once is problematic with cards that reveal the top card of your library. There's only one way for a card to become foretold that isn't foretelling it. Gift of Doom becomes attached to a creature when it's turned face up, and that needed a special rule specifying how that worked. Misbind Click has an ability that triggers when you champion something with it. Honestly, I'm surprised that one even made it into the CR. This card is a creature on one side and a sorcery on the other. So we have this rule here to prevent the situation where a face-up sorcery could be on the battlefield. And Vizier of Many Faces changes how Embalm works. There's actually one other card with its own rule relating to unique use of a keyword. Hensley Toolbox Tor gives all your creatures Blitz, and it turns out that for technical reasons, there's actually a little bit more to that than, for example, giving them all Flash or Unearth. As a result, this card didn't originally function correctly when it was first printed, and the rules involved needed to change in order to accommodate it. To my knowledge, this is the most recent card that has had its own unique rule added after the card was printed, rather than having the rule debut at the same time as the card. It stands to reason that cards with interesting interactions behind their unique rules have perhaps been featured on this channel before, and indeed I covered Ashiok Wicked Manipulator shortly after it came out. Soulfire Eruption was another one of my favorite recent videos because I actually learned about its unique rule in the process of making it. It seems weird to me that Trinisphere is the only card that sets a cost, but maybe that's because there are so many rules questions about it, and maybe that's a good thing. Worms of the Earth makes the list for its unique interactions with Dryad Arbor. I covered a similar interaction when I talked about Grist plus Grafdigger's Cage, and I wouldn't feel right making a video about unique rules and not featuring a single specific question, so here's an appropriately thematic one. Amy's enchanted by Paradox Haze, and Nick wants to cast Reset. Can he cast it during Amy's second upkeep, or does he need to wait until all of Amy's upkeeps are over? It turns out that Reset has this unique rule to answer this question. For its part, while there are plenty of cards that can give you an additional combat phase, Paradox Haze is the only one that can give you an extra step. Here's another fun one. What would happen if Wall of Stolen Identity copies a Grizzly Bear while you control Essence of the Wild? Well, it turns out that if you say you're copying the Grizzly Bears with the Wall's ability, the Essence of the Wild's ability still applies. So the Wall will end up as an Essence of the Wild. Then, because of this specific rule here, the Essence of the Wild is not tapped. A lot of the cards that are left are like this, requiring their own rules because of some specific mechanic or interaction that can only come up just for them. Elemental Resonance needs these rules to clarify its interaction with Hybrid or Phyrexian mana. Speaking of Phyrexian symbols, Rage Extractor is the only one to use the Phi symbol by itself. Niv Mizzet Reborn needed this rule to formalize the notion of a color pair. Storm King's Thunder needed to be able to transfer the X from its mana cost to the delayed triggered ability that it creates. Nico is the only card that makes shard tokens. Kaya's Emblem lets you play a card from the Exile Zone, but only if it's legendary, and if it started out face down, then that would have some extra complications that are explained by this rule. Midnight Clock's ability that triggers when the 12th hour counter is put on it needs this rule to spell out exactly how that trigger condition functions. I couldn't believe it either, but Sideswipe is the only card to date that lets you, quote, change any targets, unquote, of a spell. Tangarth is the only card that says it's attacking, and while Wizards of the Coast made a whole rule for Furkrog to define what it means to say that a creature had to attack, they couldn't be bothered to define what couldn't attack means while they were at it. Here's a fun one. Did you know that it is possible to stop having a Monarch? Yep, Jared truly is the heir of Karth the Lion because it too has its own rule. If the Monarch dies and all the remaining players have something that says they cannot be the Monarch, then there just stops being one. And that means we also need a special rule for Fealty to the Realm that spells out how it works if that were to happen. And then there's this rule here. Any similarities you see between it and any person, living or deceased, are entirely coincidental. And that's all of them, I think. Like I said before, this is a hard topic to claim to make a comprehensive list on. If I become aware of any errors or oversights, I'll make a pinned comment detailing them. And remember, there's new cards and new rules coming out every couple of weeks. So if you're watching this video in the far future, some stuff has probably changed since then. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again to all of my lovely patrons. I really appreciate all of you. Join me again next time for another daily ruling. And until then, I hope you have a great day.